Ladies and gentlemen, my name is David Mnyai, and I'm the co-director for the Confucius Institute. I'm here in my capacity as a partner with CAF, and I would like to invite the chair for today's event and to introduce. There are only one issue on the table. I think you'll see a form. Can you be so kind to fill it as we complete so that we can improve on our programs and the activities that we carry? And Wally, Serote, you can take over as the chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, esteemed Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we have the pleasure that two ministers, former ministers, who participated from in the 90s until around 2006, 2007, will be presenting. Former Minister Alec Erwin, seated here, who was a Minister of Public Enterprises, Minister of Trade and Industry. Former Minister Essop Pahad started as a parliamentary advisor for the President, Deputy Minister in the President's office, and Minister in the President's office. First, I would like to express gratitude for all the international people who are here, ambassadors who are here, for the fact that different countries in the world are celebrating the centenary of Nelson Mandela and Albertina Sisulu, but also to confirm that ourselves as South Africa also are celebrating this centenary, and I'm sure that features in our discussion, in the sense that the last time when we were here, there was a voice that emerged from among us here, which expressed the fact that, or an opinion rather than a fact, to say that the Mandela government, the Thabo Mbeki government sold out in terms of South Africa. And I think it's very appropriate and relevant that the people who were in government in those years, under those two presidents, are here and will talk firsthand about the vision, but also the reality that emerged from when they were there. Without wasting time, I will call on former Minister Alec Erwin to bell the cat for now. Minister, thank you. Take 30 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wally. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, you've given me 30 minutes to deal with what's an immensely complex but very, very important subject. In fact, I'm very pleased that there are a lot of young people here who are going to be our leaders now and in the future, because this debate around economic policy is in many respects the most fundamental debate for any government or political party to have. Now, I'm going to take you back a little bit, because people often forget that the alliance, the ANC, COSATU, the Communist Party, we debated these issues from the mid-1980s to 1994. In mid-1985, COSATU formed a big research group called the Economic Trends Group. It was published in a book, but we had researchers all over South Africa, many who have subsequently become very senior in academia and government, But we also had partnerships around the world. We worked very closely with groups in Canada, United Kingdom, Sweden. We were fortunate to be able to make contact with Cuba, the Communist Party. We were able to travel to the Soviet Union as it was just after the Gorbachev era. So we had massive access, because of the solidarity the ANC and the unions had. We had massive access to the experience and the economic thinking around the world. We formed in London under Max Sisulu, I think it was called the Economic Research Group on Southern Africa. And a little bit later, inside South Africa, we formed the Economic Transformation Committee in 1990 in Luthuli House. And we then had the Macroeconomic Research Group. Some of these debates stem from slightly different views from those inside the country to those outside. The Macroeconomic Research Group brought in many researchers from abroad. What we were quite clear on, absolutely clear on, was two things. And this is quite fundamental. The first was that a fully planned economy, some kind of complete revolutionary seizure of the forces of production, was not possible in South Africa, for a whole range of reasons, none the least of which the Cubans and the Chinese were advising us strongly against it, as were the Vietnamese at one point. These were study groups. We went, spoke to these people. We were pretty clear that the failure of the completely planned economy was manifest, that markets had to play some role. But we were equally clear that market fundamentalism, what I would call neoliberalism, which is a fundamental belief that markets can solve economic growth, development, and all other problems, we were crystal clear that nowhere in history had that model actually existed, number one. There is no economy that you can find that is neoliberal. If you think of the American interventions, even in recent times in their economy, that's far from anything called neoliberal. So we were quite clear on that. We did a great deal of analysis. I want to give you one example, a very important example for many of us in the trade union movement. From the late 80s, we began to organize very successfully the gigantic auto companies. And this became one of the great strengths of the union movement. So we decided, given that we had this power in the big auto companies, we better study what auto industry looked like. So we formed in the Metal and Allied Workers Union, or NUMSA as it came to be called, we formed study groups, shop steward study groups. We went all over the world, Sweden, United States, Germany, to every major auto industry. We went to Malaysia to look at what was called the Proton, which was just starting. And when those shop stewards came back, we analyzed the experience. And when we looked at the plants we had here in Rosslyn or Uitenhage, the shop stewards were unanimous. They said, we cannot possibly compete with these plants. They are completely inefficient compared to what we're seeing elsewhere in the world. So at that time, it took 33 months of a motor worker's salary to buy the cheapest car in South Africa. It took 4 months in Japan of a motor car worker to buy the cheapest car. So we realized that this industry, as soon as democracy came, this industry was going to collapse. Nearly 300,000 workers in the industry. In the assembly industry at that time, about 50,000, and in the component industry, about 80, 90,000. The highest paid workers in South Africa, virtually. So we began to realize that actually this isolation that we had been in, this closing ourselves off with high interest rates, tariff rates, was not going to work. The economy would never grow. We had too many poor people who would not be able to afford the high cost of all the products we were making. So we decided, as the union movement, that we would have to slowly modernize the economy. We would have to open the economy to greater trade and greater competition. This was the COSATU took this decision. from our economic trends group, from what happened with NUMSA in our study of the auto industry. And we were very active in the negotiations in South Africa's accession to what became the World Trade Organization. So the problem we faced was this. Think back to that time. In 1994, just before the election, the casualty rate in KZN was something like 20,000 a month, of which 5,000 or more were fatalities. This area was still exploding. We had an armed right wing that had actively taken up arms in many cases. We had massive poverty, we had had severe unemployment, we had very low growth. So we looked at this and said, look, if you do anything that destabilizes the economy further, we have to accept that South Africa doesn't have the institutional capacity, the experience or the skill to run a fully planned economy. So for those on the far left who said, look, you must nationalize everything, take over the means of production, we said that's a completely unrealistic proposition. All that will happen is our economy will further stagnate, unemployment will be worse, and this violence that we've already got could get even worse. People tend to forget that the violence in South Africa in that period, 85 to 94, the death rate was far higher than Bosnia and those areas. It was far higher than the Irish struggle. So it was a really serious period. So we took a decision, we're going to have to stabilize this economy. We had another very important access to information. Some Peter Blanche says these were secret meetings where we sold out. He's just got it wrong, I'm afraid. We met. Derek Keyes became the Minister of Trade and Industry and then Finance in the national government. And with him, we immediately set up 3 structures. The first was the Motor Industry Task Group, looking at the motor industry, because we were extremely concerned that this leading industry in our economy was going to collapse. The second was the National Economic Forum. This was business, unions, and communities with the then government, the apartheid government. And the third was, as part of the CODESA negotiations, was called the Economic Transformation Committee. Those 3 committees were able to gather a massive amount of information. What became very clear to us was that the apartheid South Africa was actually deeply in debt. There was a severe debt. In fact, when we asked Derek Keyes once, what is your total debt? He said, I can't tell you. And the reason he couldn't tell was that Ciskei, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, and others had also taken on debt. And my first job was actually Deputy Minister of Finance. And my first job in government was to hunt down that debt, to see where it was, what was happening. So we had great access to the previous government's economic situation. And that further persuaded us that our first objective was stabilization. What did we mean by stabilization? Firstly, we wanted to prevent the inflation rate from rising. That meant that we were not going to pursue what's called pump priming policies, running a deficit to put money into the economy in order that it grows. In an economy like South Africa with severe supply side problems, sorry to be technical a little bit, but with severe supply side problems, excess expenditure would just cause inflation, as we had seen and were seeing in South America at that time. It's different if you're United States and you've got a big economic structure. Then, as you've seen recently, this liberalization of finance and the big deficit they run can have a positive growth effect. There's no question about it. But we analyzed our economy and said we don't see this as being possible in generating economic growth. It's just going to generate inflation. So that meant that we would stabilize our macro position by not running massive deficits, trying to keep inflation relatively stable, and also trying to keep the exchange rate relatively stable. If our exchange rate had devalued heavily, imports would have been even more expensive, and the effect on inflation would have been positive. And thirdly, we realized, which is almost the same these days, but let me go back to then. We didn't know what public service we had. The ANC was coming in, inheriting a public service which essentially had been the apartheid public service. We had no idea whether they would sabotage us, be loyal, or work with us. In practice, it was mixed. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. So in that situation, we attempted to keep things relatively calm. We took an important decision, which was that we were going to enter international capital markets. So the ANC and the Alliance planned that process, and 6 months after the elections, we actually did enter the international capital markets to raise finance. South Africa, as you know, has got an extremely low rate of savings. So we had to remove subsidies. We had gigantic subsidies. Most of you probably not old enough to remember that there was a thing called General Export Incentive. It was a massive subsidy. So as your exchange rate, or as your export prices became less and less competitive, you pumped more and more subsidies in. It was one of the biggest single subsidies government paid was to exports, and we had to stop that. We had to stop a whole range of other subsidies. So, and we then agreed in the WTO to slowly open our economy. We agreed to a reduction of tariffs over an extended period of time, 10-year period, and we were one of the few developing countries that decided, for tactical reasons, to opt to be a developed economy in the WTO, not a developing economy. And we bound our tariffs, which was a quite important discipline. So, did we achieve what we wanted to? And here, let me just give my own opinion. I think, yes, in the basic stabilization of the economy, we were remarkably successful. We could have gone the Argentinian way, hyperinflation, loss of employment, but we didn't. We were able to stabilize that economy and keep positive growth rates. Most important of all, we kept out of the IMF and the World Bank. That was a fundamental objective as well of our stabilization program, that we were not going to borrow from the World Bank or the IMF. As one of our, Chris Liebenberg once said to the IMF, he said, look here, you guys, after what's called an Article 4 report to us, he said, look here, your solutions are far worse than our problems. And that was the end of the discussion with the IMF and with the World Bank. We first borrowed, 15 years later, we borrowed, I think, from the World Bank for some small projects. But we were kept out of the hands of the World Bank and the IMF. So I think we were relatively successful. What became clear to us, though, by 2004, was that we had massively underestimated the extent of the destruction of the black economic areas. I call them black. They're two places that were made into black economic areas. Colonization created the big reserve system. So most of the living area for the Amaxhosa people, the Zulu people, any areas of the north were locked into reserves. And think about it, no infrastructure was put in. This is way back from when finally the colonial powers are strong enough around about 1881 to enforce their power on all aspects of the African societies and chiefdoms and kingdoms. They put no infrastructure in. The Union government did less. It also put no infrastructure into those areas. And the apartheid government did even less and made every single attempt to try and prevent any infrastructural development within the former colonial reserve areas. And we were beginning to see that we were making no impact. Economic growth was not reaching these areas in any way whatsoever. Some of you may recall President Mbeki was strongly criticized for a paper he wrote called The Second Economy, or Two Economies. And everyone said, we're one economy. He said, yeah, we might be one economy, but look what's happening. In the rural areas and in the black township areas, we're making no impact at all. So we attempted to start changing from 2004. So I think stabilization worked, but we had not made a structural impact on the areas of black poverty. And I'm afraid to say to this day, we haven't made a structural impact on the areas of black poverty. So for me, I think we've wasted 10 years. Everything we needed to do to make a structural impact on black poverty was not done from 2008 to 2017. The state corporations were weakened, the fiscal position declined. One of our objectives, as I should briefly say, was to get what's called in budgetary terms a primary surplus. A primary surplus means you're collecting more tax than you have to pay interest. So you're covering your current expenditure and you've got more than enough to pay your interest. The reason we were driving for that was we realized that the state itself would have to put money into infrastructure. The only way it could do that fast and quickly was through a primary surplus on your budget, which we had by 2007. So, in summary, the problem we realized in 2004 sits full square on the table today. The stabilization of the economy, those policies, I wouldn't call them neoliberal, I'd call them a correct response to South Africa's political economic situation. We stabilized that economy. When we realized that we were making too little impact on the areas of black poverty and began shifting, we had 1 year to do that. The new administration came in and slowly retreated from all these issues. It got a bigger and bigger fiscal deficit, collected less and less tax, the growth rate was stagnant, wasn't growing at all, and it had weakened all its institutions of local and provincial government. So where we need the greatest capacity, which is in communities, what we can see now every day is the capacity at that level is too weak. So quite rightly, people are protesting. They must. So the problem we face is not so much some dramatic new policy, all this stuff, radical economic transformation. I must be frank, I see absolutely nothing that's transformed for the positive. What's more important than just getting the land is what we do with the land. And how do we reshape our cities so we don't continue 25 years after democracy to still have black ghettos and white enclaves. Great challenges. Don't worry about neoliberal Marxism. Just get down and bloody think and do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Without wasting time, I'll call on Dr. Pahad.
Yeah, Comrade Wally, thanks. Thanks, Comrade Alec. I think we all agreed that this was a brief but very instructive assessment of where we were and what we needed to do. Thanks, Alec. In my own input, I'm going to concentrate on the political and international climate and context of that period that Alec was talking about, post-94 period. Let me start by looking at the international situation in context. Hopefully during question time, maybe Aziz will talk about the foreign policies that we pursued. I think what we should remember was that by the time we came to 1990, when we were unbanned, the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries in Eastern Europe had collapsed. That collapse had a profound impact upon, for example, Cuba, which suffered great economic dislocation. A Cuba which played such a crucial role in defeating the might of the South African military machine in Angola. Vietnam and China itself was just entering the first decade of its opening up policies, was not yet in a position to challenge the more powerful Western countries. So we were in a situation in which we had, in every sense of the word, a unipolar world. a world which was dominated by US imperialism and the EU. It's in that context that I think we need to understand that we then win the elections in 1994. And without the Soviet Union, you didn't have that alternative, whatever the mistakes they made, which could act as an alternative attractive pole. But this also had a profound impact upon a lot of the economies of a number of African countries. Our own frontline countries were facing huge economic and socio-economic problems. So all around us, in addition to what Alec was talking about, our own economy, incidentally, Alec, we inherited an actually totally bankrupt economy in 94. Now I want us to understand that it's in this context that we then assume in 1994, the ANC assumes political power, not economic power. And we are in a coalition government. As part of the negotiations with the National Party, we had de Klerk as one of the other deputy presidents and the IFP. India itself, with its own different protectionist economy, was not yet in the position that we would have wanted them to come in with huge investments in our country. Today, India, by the way, is the sixth most powerful economy in the world. So when you have this BRICS meeting taking place, we are in a totally different context in which we can seriously think about raising capital and investments from the BRICS countries, China, India, Russia. The second element that we need to look at is the strength of monopoly capital, both internationally and in our own country, in South Africa. Now, if you want to look at big capital, it has its different fractions. It may be industrial, it may be manufacturing, but by the 1990s, finance capital had become the most powerful and dominant fraction of capital in the world. And this then had its own impact upon the process of globalization. Now, this then has a great impact on all our economies, but especially the developing countries. You had, which took place, by the way, before 1994 in this country, a great deal of the illegal flight of capital, which we don't know still how much money was taken out of this country illegally. You had withdrawal of investments. You had the consequences of sanctions that we fought for on the apartheid economy. And therefore, you could not decide that you were going to follow policies, whether political or social or cultural or economic, which are going to be so radical, because it's nice to say you're going to follow radical policies, that you'd actually cause much greater destabilization in your own system. Now that's what we have to take into account. What also was the power of big capital? And even now, if we want to talk about economy and politics and revolution and struggle, we need to factor in the power of big capital. More or less, at that time, two progressive forces internationally, partly because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the other socialist countries, the difficulties that Cuba and Vietnam were facing, were also in retreat. Now, in South Africa itself, we had a negotiated settlement to the conflict. Never mind what anybody else says, just understand this thing. That the liberation movement in South Africa, at which the ANC was a leading force, We used to sing a song about how we were going to march to Pretoria. Well, we're not going to march to Pretoria with our AK-47s. But the apartheid regime, with all its military might, was not in a position to defeat the revolutionary movement here in South Africa. It itself was not in a position in which it could withstand the mass democratic forces that had arisen in South Africa through the UDF, through COSATU. So there was a stalemate between the forces for change and the forces of reaction. And it is in that context that we decided, and the apartheid regime decided, that a negotiated settlement was the best course for our country, the people, the African continent, and progressive humanity. So it's part of this apartheid legacy, and I want us to understand one thing. If you think you can get rid of the legacy of apartheid within 10, 20 years, you've got another thing coming. And I'll come back to that. So we still live with the legacy of apartheid. We still have to overcome much of the legacy of apartheid. Alec mentioned, for example, that just prior to 94, you will recall that Chris Hani was assassinated in 93. There was an ever-present danger of a serious counter-revolutionary assault by the extreme right-wing Afrikaners. Now, these were very highly trained professional soldiers. They were heavily armed. And if you want to understand what happened in Ireland, for example, where small groups of the IRA were able to destabilize the whole British government in Northern Ireland and even in London itself, you can imagine what an organized counter-revolutionary force coming from the white right could have done to our country. So you had to deal with that. At the same time, Alec mentioned how many thousands of our people were dying because of the violence. Then we have to link this with the clandestine military and intelligence and security networks that were operating in this country, that are still operating in this country. Let me tell you the truth. We still don't know how heavily infiltrated we were by the apartheid security forces and the apartheid military intelligence. We still don't know. And sometimes when I think about what's happening in our country, I think, to what extent are those old forces still able to continue to destabilize us and to continue to push us into positions that we don't want to take? So I think we need to understand that this is what we're facing. Then you had the situation of we had to integrate to form a new South African National Defence Force. So essentially we had to integrate our MK combatants who decided to go into the army, and there were many of us who went into the political side, and combatants from APLA. Relative to the sheer size, strength, military know-how, technical know-how, knowledge of conventional warfare of the old SADF, we were at a great, great disadvantage. Now we had to integrate these people into one South African National Defence Force. It was no easy task. But for that you also needed to have stability. You also needed to give stability to those old security forces, to those old military leaders, that they had some role to play in a new and democratic South Africa. We inherited a public service. Alec mentioned that. But understand this. that old public service was all white, all male. They didn't even put white women in leading positions. Their white women were secretaries who left work at 4 o'clock to do their hair before they went home. Now, you then win an election in '94. Alec walks in as a deputy minister. Nobody knows him there. So in the beginning, by the way, a lot of their cabinet members and documents were written in Afrikaans, and then they translated it into English. But we had to work with this public service. This is what we inherited. And I would go a bit further than Alec. I think many of them actually tried to serve this new democratic revolutionary government as well as they could. But they had no understanding of the economic, political, social, cultural policies of the African National Congress and its allies. None. Their only understanding was that we were a group of terrorists. So they themselves had to begin to try to understand what we were trying to do. What are the policies that we want to pursue? We had to carry out both a triple political, demographic, and gender revolution in the public service. And I must tell you now that I think we did a bloody good job of carrying out a revolution in the public service. Today, almost all our DGs are Africans. Almost the entire senior public service is African. And hopefully, within the next 10 years, we'll be in a situation in which at least 50% of all senior managers in the public service are women. Then you had to integrate South Africa. You had the Bantustans. You had to take spending on health and education that was disproportionately spent on whites. For every 5 rand spent on a white child, only 1 rand was spent on an African child. But it's the same pot that you're taking from. But you had to redistribute that money in a way in which you tried to address some of the most serious education, health, social policies, and other problems that we face. There was no welfare for Africans in this country. None. We had to introduce it. Disabilities that I was responsible for. If you were an African and you were a disabled person, my friend, you were just told, go and look after yourself. We introduced a disability grant so that today, it's so wonderful to know that all these male chauvinists go and talk in the toilet but not in public anymore. They're so afraid to be a male chauvinist in public. So, then Aziz can talk on the foreign policy. The only really organized force we had as a movement was COSATU. ANC, we had to begin the process of restructuring our organization, setting up branches, but bringing in a whole lot of new people. We didn't know what the hell we were recruiting. You just signed a form, you became a member. The same with the SACP. So right from the beginning, we had to start from scratch, building this organization, except COSATU, which already had a strong organized base. We didn't. We had to do this. We had to put this in place. Then we had elections. So we took some of our best people, sent them to parliament, sent them to provincial legislatures. Some we said will go into the public service. When the local government elections came, I'm afraid to say, and we must admit this, that we were left with the weakest people to put into the most important structure of government, that's local government. And that's why if you try to understand even now what the difficulties we face at the level of municipal government, is partly the fault that we made, that we didn't put some of our best people in those structures. Lastly, in conclusion, let me say this. Did we do some good things? Yes. Could we have done better? Yes. Should we have done better? Yes. But did we sell out? I say a resounding no, we did not sell out. If we talk about decolonizing, and of course that's what all the students are talking about, decolonizing the curriculum and everything else, and it's very correct that that's what we must do. I want to quote here from somebody I consider a trailblazer and profound thinker and writer on the theory and practice of decolonization, and that's Professor Sabelo Ndlovu Gasheni. Now, he in his book, Decolonial Mandela, wrote, and I'm going to quote him, to the rest of the world, and a reminder that peace, negotiations, democracy, religious tolerance, racial equity, and I'll put in parentheses, gender equity, and economic inclusion are the most potent weapons against human suffering. Thank you very much.
I'm sure everybody will agree with me, given the two presentations, it will be very tempting to pontificate and talk about many, many things. I am going to ensure that I stick to facilitation so that I don't pontificate. I will then ask everybody else to discipline themselves also. Be sharp to the point, ask your question. If you are commenting, make a sharp, short comment. We will start here with hands. Any hands here?
I was fascinated by your description of the problems that you faced in transforming South Africa. It happens that I've worked for about 10 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, across the Soviet Union, and I think it was very wise to avoid to go their plan. It would have been enormously costly for South Africa and very damaging for your economy. But I have two questions. I mean, one, the first time I arrived in South Africa, it was by chance in 2011, and I was stricken by the two economies. It was very clear that you had a completely dualistic economy, as we call it, in Europe. And the key issue when you have such a dualistic economy is the level of regulation that you impose. Either you impose a regulation that suits the advanced economy, or you impose a level of regulations that allow the developing economy to develop. So this is the first question. And linked to this is the fact that if I look now at the economy, it looks like an economy that is devised with a high level of regulation to protect monopolies or oligopolies. And if you need growth, you need to have small industries popping up everywhere, which would need the regulation. The question is, what is your view on this? Thank you very much.
I'm just being opportunistic. I just want to find out whether is there any plausible explanation of the assumption that in the first few 10, 15 years of our economic growth, we actually had growth without jobs. Is there any plausible explanation that will enable us to better understand why, and if it was so, why did we actually have something like that if it wasn't indeed the case? That's the one question. This is a very important question because it keeps on cropping up. Everybody else now who talks about economic growth says it will be with jobs. But I know that in the last 10 years, we've been saying stuff that we couldn't explain to ourselves. But a plausible explanation, please. And the second one is perhaps around the issue of continuing to break our country up into provinces. which to a large extent take a dimension of pretty much something not too different from the previous breakup that we had. The rationale, perhaps it's very important, but also what are the dangers of still continuing to? Because there are signs that are beginning to show us that the stuff that's happening there that may be quite serious down the line. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. Thank you for having me this evening. My name is TK, Singapore Ambassador or High Commissioner. I have a question on the policy options before 1994 and specifically on devaluation. I mean, I ask this question more as an economic historian rather than as an ambassador. And coming from Singapore, of course, we don't support competitive devaluation. But we also know that, in economic history, some countries have devalued their currency in times of great crisis, including the US when they went off the gold standard. So I was wondering, to what extent did these study groups in the alliance or COSATU look at devaluation as an option? Because here, it's a very isolated economy, and perhaps the dangers of inflation, which is often cited as the reason not to devalue, is less of a concern. And in any case, many of your exports are in US dollars, your minerals, and devaluation arguably has some benefit. And of course, the biggest losers in devaluation are the wealthy people, because their assets in US dollar terms will be worth less. So my question is, to what extent was this considered, and what happened if, or was it as Deputy Minister Essop Pahad said, in 1994, the democratic government only had political control and no economic control, and political control did not extend to this aspect of the economic policies. So thank you.
Good day. My name is Yanda Jawula. I would like to ask the panel, in the countries that got independence in the 90s, are there any countries that you know of that have done better than South Africa, socially, economically, and politically, in Africa and throughout the world, especially in Eastern Europe, in Africa, including countries like Rwanda and them? And if there are those who've done better than South Africa, how did they do it, if there are those who've done better?
Thank you, sir. My name is Pilani Nongogo. I wanted to ask the question that I think it's been in the public domain for a while now, and I want explanation as well as to why. I mean, Alec talked about the huge apartheid debt that the South African government inherited. Why then? This is what I want to find out. Why did the government then continue to pay apartheid debt, especially in the face of huge campaigns against that? That's I think, a straightforward question. The second one will be, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, recommendations came through. Part of them was reparation for the victims. And again, those people were not, taken in and covered along those lines. And those people happen to be Black people. And many a times, the issue of selling out comes from that angle. So can you explain that to me as to why then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations were not taken in? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We represent the embassy. And I had a question actually to both Mr. Erwin and Pahad. Thank you very much for the interesting expose. Do you think that we now live in a less unipolarized world? And what opportunities does that bring for South Africa and its economic policy? Thank you.
Greetings to the sitting. Comment and question. Interesting observation there. We have political liberation, but we don't have economic emancipation. But with that statement, it is easy to say that there is no political emancipation without economic emancipation. So moving forward from that, with the clashes that we have and the ANC has acquired or has gathered from the post-colonial apartheid and which we face ourselves into now. For us to move forward, when Prof said that South Africa is not ready for development. When we say we are not ready for development or it doesn't have the capacity for development, what exactly do we mean by that? Is it we need financial intelligence or agricultural intelligence, or did we stop developing and we've hit a glass ceiling and that has put us in a stagnation to not even develop and acquire the long preached about economic emancipation from the political power that we have regained or we have claimed. So from that observation, I want to ask this question. That was a comment. When or how or when is it that we'll emancipate ourselves from these economic clashes or from these clashes that will have us perpetuate Millennium Manumission from these bipolar economic activities that is currently happening in the fourth industrial revolution? Thank you.
Well, that was a great bunch of questions. We could certainly have another 4 hours on it, I think, but let me try and be fairly brief on each of them. I think it's a very important point you've made, that how do you deal with these two very different economies? And I think what's clear now is that you cannot deal with them in exactly the same way. So the regulatory environment, for example, around building and things like that, we need to re-examine that. We need to think about it. This is not to say, as Mbeki argued in that paper, that you want to keep these economies in an underdeveloped stage. But we need much more aggressive thought as to how to get infrastructure into these areas, how to create economic opportunity, and above all, how to reintegrate them back into the single economy. We've got to break down the barrier that exists. When you go through these areas, you'll always find the infrastructure is divided. In the black area, the main infrastructure stops, and then it starts again in the white. We haven't replanned our cities, which was an original intention we had. So I'm going to go right to your last question. South Africa has the capacity to change this. What you need is consistent, well-organized policies that address these areas and the economics of these areas. We can do it. It's normally referred to in one or other way as a developmental state. If you watch developmental states, the hallmark of a developmental state is coordination, determination, and persistence of policy. So the biggest mistake we made was we did a big switch in 2008. We wasted 10 years. We've got to come back now and reorganize the state, strengthening the bottom institutions as much as we strengthen the top. So I don't think South Africa doesn't have the capacity. It definitely has the capacity. We're more fortunate than most African economies. We have the industrial capacity to supply the infrastructure. We have the funding to do it. Funding is not the major obstacle at all to this development. It's the application of it in the correct way. So I think South Africa, with thought, and let's hope this is the new dawn, where we start thinking again, where we start implementing, where we cut out all the factions, where we get down to work to get our people out of poverty. On monopolies, serious problem for us. We put in the Competition Commission. One of the tensions you've got in an economy our size is that to compete on international markets, let's say in our petrochemicals like Sasol, you've got to be pretty big. But that size of competition in the world markets is a monopoly in the domestic market. So I think we've done reasonably well in curbing some of the monopolies, but probably we could be a bit tougher these days, in my view. The legislation's there. There's no problem with the legislation, it's there. Where we've had least success is small and medium enterprises. And frankly, I think this is a major structural problem. We're only going to open the possibilities for small and medium enterprises when we begin spreading the investment across the whole community, allowing people in black neighborhoods to develop genuine businesses. Thus far, the BEE is really just a rearrangement of the existing assets between white and black. So it's not a growth promoter. We need growth with the development of small and medium enterprises. Growth without jobs, I think a very important point. The main reason I would give for that is that in order to grow, we had to make our enterprises more efficient. We were dropping tariffs, we were reorganizing the enterprises towards competition, and we, in the process, lost jobs while we were growing. So it was a tension. Growth brought about some new enterprises, but lost jobs in the old enterprises. Question is, why don't you keep the old enterprises? Frankly, because we would have lost some whole sectors completely. Some industrial sectors would have just disappeared. All our electronic equipment would have disappeared. It was entirely dependent on a captured market before. Auto industry would have disappeared. Then we would have had no growth and massive job losses. So it's part of the structural change that was necessary. What was our solution to get out of it? There was essentially two major approaches that we argued. One was that for the South African economy to grow, its industries need to grow. For its industries to grow, Africa needs to grow. So for us, Africa is absolutely fundamental. And that's not just that we just want to sell industrial products to them, no. We want them to grow so that we can do what European and American economies do. They trade industrial products. So for us, Africa's growth is critical. You'll remember the NEPAD policy that South Africa was very instrumental in bringing about. So we realized that unless Africa begins growing, South Africa can't grow. So we need a structural change. We're too small an economy in the world to just lead to massive high growth. And the second thing we did, which you'll see tomorrow the results of it, it was South Africa that reached out for BRICS. You may remember that. It was the South African president, Mbeki, that took the initial moves. Actually, the first move came in the trade negotiations. When in the trade negotiations, we made contact with China before its accession to WTO. Russia, Brazil, India were key allies for us in the trade negotiations. In the Singapore round, we already started to form some of these alliances. But we then moved really, because the question is, I'll answer the other question, do we still have a unipolar world? No, not at all. We have a very different world. I wouldn't, for me, the American power has retracted so dramatically that Trump may not realize it, but it has. So for South Africa, the BRICS and the southern part, we used to call it a butterfly. These economies are fundamental. As Essop said, the economic conditions of today are fundamentally different. There's a complete sea change in the global economy in the present situation. Provinces, were they wise? I don't know. Most people don't spend enough time looking at our constitution, though. If you look at the constitution, we are an interesting combination. This is not a completely decentralized federation. The control over finance, norms, and standards that we put into the Constitution are very considerable. I think what's been very weak in the last 10 years especially, but we also made mistakes in the first period. We did not implement that constitutional structure in relation to provinces and local government fully. We should have implemented it much more effectively than we have. But they're a historical reality. I think that given the constitutional provisions to coordinate them, they can well be a good thing. We're just not implementing those policies well enough. Ambassador, a very interesting question you asked. Yes, it was thoroughly debated. But I would say that the reasons for not going for it are partly historical. In South Africa, we've had very low rates of inflation historically because of the importance of gold and also because of the strength of our balance of payments as a result of gold and our minerals. So we're a society that's not used to much inflation. When in the mid-80s, inflation started to rise to 5, 6, 7, 8%, at one point 18%. And to be honest, we thought that the inflationary effects of devaluation would be greater than the growth effects. For a few reasons, all our exports are commodities. So what determines their price at any point in time can vary dramatically from why you're devaluing. So the benefits of a devaluation would have gone to a limited number of exports and export sectors. and had an adverse impact, in our analysis at the time, had an adverse impact on buying power, because one of our great weaknesses in South Africa, even to this day, is the weakness in consumer durable production. We import far, far too much consumer durables. The only successful story we've had is automotive, where we balance of payments neutral. But on most other consumer durables, we deficit. So that was our analysis. I think we were probably right. When we had an enforced depreciation in 1998, the economy didn't respond all that well. Capital good costs rose. Our exports didn't expand as fast as we thought. So the policy we opted for, which is pretty much still our policy, is to keep an effective real exchange rate constant. So we try and devalue by the differential in inflation between our trading partners. I think we were probably right. Have countries in a similar situation? Look, the sort of where would our comparators be? It would be probably some of the South Americans, but they didn't get independence at that time. But the South American economies, so the Eastern European economies, I would say, are not a good comparator with South Africa. For those that have gone into the EU, like Poland, they've had a massive benefit from doing that, even though they haven't got all the subsidies that everyone else got, but they've got enough that's been good for them. So I would say, if we look at the new industrial economies in the mid-1990s, Brazil, Argentina, India in a way, China, some of the Southeast Asian economies, we've done roughly the same as most of them. Of course, China and India are not new industrial economies. They're giants which have changed. So why did we pay apartheid debt? It's an interesting one. We made a judgment, an analysis, which was that those countries that have defaulted have suffered more. So we looked at our situation. We felt that we could handle that debt payment. And in fact, we did. By 1999, we had pretty much written that debt off. So it was a judgment call in the context that Essop and I have been trying to paint, a very unstable, difficult situation. And I just want to reinforce Essop's point. Anyone who underestimates the power of financial capital is lost. Those that can afford to ignore international capital are those with strong and effective state-owned companies. Now, that's what we were trying to build, strong and effective state-owned companies, because that does allow you to slightly step aside from the power of private capital. But we were not in that position at that time. We just weren't there. So we made a decision it would cost us less to repay the debt than to try and default on it. Remember too that it was a coalition government. If we had dug deep into the debt, we would have found some extremely uncomfortable things, which would have worked against the attempts we were having to reconcile our people's former common states. These are judgment calls, which I think we were correct on at that time. The TRC recommendations, I'm less familiar with to the best of my knowledge, most of the recommendations were implemented as far as I'm aware. And the main thrust of the TRC was not necessary recompense, it was truth. And conciliation was the thrust of it, rather than some kind of recompense. Certainly the campaigns to eliminate debt, these were good causes, but as the government and the party at the time, we made the decision that to try and do that would cost us more than it would gain us. I think we're not in the same polarized world, and as I answered at the end, I think we're in a very good position to implement development if we can get ourselves politically organized and united and get down to work of developing the economy in the right way. Thank you.
We are now in a much better position in terms of the balance of forces in the world. In fact, we're hosting the BRICS summit in this coming week. And already we see some impact of BRICS on the economy with the bank and so on and so forth. It seems to me that the direction that BRICS should move in is how to get greater unity and cohesion, first of all, amongst the BRICS partners themselves. And that's not easy because you've got India and you've got China there who have their own conflicts. But at least try to come to some common understanding on how to deal with a great number of the international problems that we face. But we are in a better position now than we were before, and certainly China and India in a more powerful position. So yes, the world has changed, but not as much as some of us had hoped in our idealism that it would change. But never mind, it will change, don't worry. With respect to the continent, it still remains true, and Alec has said this, but let me really emphasize this, that we must stop thinking that we are going to grow our economy and develop our economy and do everything else outside of the African continent. We're not going to do it. So our first and foremost political, economic, trading, everything else, partners must be the African continent. But there are a lot of problems with respect to it, even in SADC. Notice Alec was leading our team on SADC. We took all kinds of decisions. I don't know how many decisions we haven't implemented around the whole question of the free movement of capital, goods, services. And Alec wasn't agreeing with me. I've been arguing, you must open up your labor now. You can't just say you want your capital and goods to go, but you want to close your borders. And who do you want to close your borders to? To the poorest of our people who are coming from our neighbors. So you got money, you can come, don't worry. We've got to change that. We've got to open up in a unified and cohesive manner and understand what this means, but it would be a great boost to our economy, to our skills levels. So we've got to move in those areas of greater integration across the board. The last question, Eastern Europe, let me say this, having spent 10 years in Czechoslovakia. The one they say that's most successful is Poland. What the Germans did was they took their factories and put them on the border with Poland so they could get all the cheap Polish workers to come and work in the German factories. And the Poles were very, very highly skilled. Actually, so were the Czechoslovakians. In machine industry, the Czechoslovakians were probably the most highly skilled in the world. Then you became part of the EU, so you were beneficiary of all the largesses that the EU could give you, your trade, your economic relations, and everything else. And then you can pretend that Russia is a threat, and then get America to put more money and more arms in your country. So have they done better than us? I don't think so. And those people who were living in those countries under socialism, at least one thing they were sure of was the transport cost was cheap, rent was cheap. At least you had some kind of housing. Of course, you didn't have the consumer goods, which is what people want. Of course, people want consumer goods. Of course, people wanted the right to travel more freely, which they have now. So no, I would say we did very well in comparison to those. And the comparison you must also make with Spain and Greece, because both Greece and Spain came out of fascist governments. What helped them? Never mind that Greece ran into serious problems in the last decade, was that they became part of the EU. So you had a big EU that was able to help these countries' economies grow, to help their trade, to give them political stability, to assist them to get political stability. And the last question I don't want to do with Eastern Europe, is to have pro-fascist movements in my country. They've got them in Poland, they've got them in Hungary, they've got them in Czechoslovakia, they've got them in Romania. We don't want them here.
I'm sure everybody will agree with me that there is reason to be positive and optimistic, but we'll elaborate on that as we go along. We're taking questions from this place here.
I have two questions. The first question is, to what extent can we say the South African economy has been or is progressive, despite the fact that there's been the exclusion, even post-1994, of Black youth, in particular Black female youth? To what extent can we say this economy is progressive? Has it not sold out? And has it not maybe been neoliberal? And two, don't you think that maybe some of the great initiatives you initiated as the post-apartheid government, such as BEE, could have done much more better? There was proper mechanisms, legislative mechanisms, to ensure that there is massive beneficiation and that everyone, not a few group, benefits from these great initiatives the post-apartheid government started. Thank you.
If we are going to labor under that impression that it's okay to take 100 years to reverse apartheid's reality, that is a bit defeatist. Our policymakers have to have the activist mentality, the mentality that we had in defeating apartheid, should prevail in our policymaking, reality. We're in a room full of youngsters here. These youngsters want to see policymakers who have not given into long processes of doing things. For instance, the township, as Alec rightly said, the township is an apartheid reality, and we build RDP houses with apartheid special planning. What are we saying about these youngsters? Are we condemning them to live in the periphery and further away from the periphery? We've got to change. We've got to learn from countries like like Singapore. Singapore consciously started implementing policies that were reversing their past. Let us have a change in our mindset when it comes to policy making. Let us learn from the best for the sake of these kids.
Two quick questions. The first one is that nowadays the popular narrative is that over time our economic policies changed from the initial RDP to GEAR to ASGISA, and now contained within the NDP, the new economic approach. And the perception is that each of those successes policies was linked to a shift in the balance of forces towards the influence of private capital and the role that both domestic and international capital played in forcing us into a more liberal economic approach. And my question is, how much truth is there in that? And if it wasn't a shift in the balance of forces, what was it that led us to reassess and redefine the economic patterns that we chose to follow as a nation? And the second question is, if, and I would agree, the current way out of the stagnation we find ourselves in, if small and medium enterprises are so critical, is it possible for us to relook at the role that state-owned enterprises are playing and think again about how revitalized or rejuvenated state-owned enterprises might not play a bigger role in helping to drive and stimulate and encourage those small and medium enterprises?
Thank you very much.
My question is more about the initial processes. I seem to get the impression that part of the process involved learning by doing, you know. And if you go through such a process, there's a likelihood that you make repetitions, you make a lot of mistakes, and therefore repeat yourself. Take, for instance, the question about poverty issues. As was recognized, there wasn't much done in the rural settings, in the Transkei, in the Bophuthatswana. Bophuthatswana maybe was so better off in those rural settings. And as of now, poverty rate is still stubbornly high at about 30%. That is 30% of the population living on less than $2, 26 rands a day. My worry is that after 25 years, we don't seem to have made any dramatic shift, especially in addressing issues of poverty. And of course, on the other issue is, related issue is institutions. In the country, it's only the economic clusters that seems to be well functioning. Most other institutions are really not functioning as well as the economic cluster. What really accounts for that? I mean, you know, because my whole premise is that there was an element of learning by doing. But for certain institutions, they were kind of insulated, and perhaps they have propelled or stabilized the country. So how do we really deal with this issue? Because part of the process, I think the ANC indicated that they were going to set up schools that will help train the young cadres in governance. I'm not sure whether in fact we have done it.
The colleague who was sitting there said that, asked a question to the effect that about economic growth without job creation. It is true that President Thabo Mbeki presided over an economy that grew for 4.5% at the time. And considering the fact that he came into power in 1999, at the time, immediately thereafter, you had Y2K, which led to a massive depression in the world. That means that the administration did very well. The hypothetical position that I'm putting across is I noticed that both Comrade Allen and Comrade Essop spoke a great deal about the efforts of the liberation movement and the new government after apartheid and creating stability. That is correct, because I think that is what the theme is about. But the hypothetical position that I want to bring about is, what was the role of the private sector in this matter? Did the private sector actually come into the party? Because I don't understand that government on its own can create jobs, or government actually, from an economic point of view, doesn't create jobs. And my postulation is that actually I think the private sector was out and out to undermine the new government or the new democratic government in South Africa. As of now, the private sector is sitting with about 689.4 billion that has not been reinvested in the economy. If that money were to be invested in the economy, it would serve to answer the question that is being asked by this colleague here as to whether we can say that this is a progressive government when there are so many young people who are out of employment. In actual fact, David Lipton of the IMF actually makes that point, that there cannot be growth in this country when 1/3, he says 1/3, but I think it is actually more than 1/3 of the people in this country being outside of formal employment. It is impossible that we can have that kind of growth. And I think, if I may use a very strong term in my position, my view is that the private sector is betraying the democracy. And I wonder whether President Cyril is going to succeed, because he wants to generate 100 billion in 5 years. But if our own business or corporate citizens are not prepared to invest in this country, and they are not showing confidence in the democratic dispensation, I'm not sure we're going to make it. Thank you very much.
On the exclusion of youth in the economy, I think the most serious problem we have is not creating enough employment for those youth that we have put through various educational institutes. I also agree with you strongly that you've raised, as young people, the right thing. Have the curricula in these higher institutions been the correct one for our purposes? So that's a debate that's really worth having. I think we've got to look at it. The issue is, how can we create more employment? I'm going to come back to that a bit later. You asked a specific question, beneficiation. You can pass as many laws as you want, but if capital doesn't put the capital there, you will fail. So the best way I can answer your question is by turning to Tommy and saying, if we look at growth models, and many people have referred to Singapore, and it's a very interesting one, my analysis is that the only sustained growth you've ever had in the last 100 years is where the state has led the process. And the state leads the process in a number of ways. Number one, as I said, by consistent and clear policy. So that will come to your later point. Consistent and clear policy, by having clarity what it's trying to do. And those states that have succeeded, watch them, without exception, they have got state-owned enterprises. The international financial markets, they operate with efficient managerial policies, they're able to raise capital in the international markets. The thing that distinguishes them completely from the private sector, and it will be part of my later answer, is that they have long-term investment programs. So they don't have to maximize their profits, but they've got to earn the rate of return that can implement their program. So it's a much more complex economic model. Singapore, through Temasek, led the way with this. If you look at Finland, Finland's got Solidium Oy, led the way. They have small enough economies to have a single powerful company. In Singapore, they had excellent, alongside it, we went and studied it for a long time. Alongside it was the Enterprise Development Board, which took the investments from Temasek and put small enterprises around it. Excellent model. China, India, all those economies that are structurally changing, Russia have got big state companies. Because you cannot rely, Tommy, you cannot rely on private capital to lead your growth process. If you want to grow and grow for a long period of time, the state must drive that process. What's happened to us in the last 10 years, we were getting to a point where we were about to reach that arrangement, where we were going to drive the infrastructure through Eskom, Transnet, where we were driving industrial investment through many other activities, and giving confidence to the private sector and opening opportunities. As soon as we weakened the state enterprises, the private sector slipped back, because they started very hostile. Let me tell you, the private sector was not on our side to begin with, at all. It took us a long time to get them there, and then they slipped back for understandable reasons. So if we want growth and inclusion of economies, and that, we need to reestablish the correct balance of power. And that is, the state must lead growth. The private sector adds to that growth. It doesn't cause the growth, it adds to that growth. That's absolutely central. So I agree with you. We must be more activists. We must change our minds. The opportunities for growth by changing our minds are massive. So yes, I agree. Essop's point is correct. The structural damage was much bigger than we thought. What I didn't stress enough was, if you think about apartheid, all right, in 1960, actually what apartheid did was to systematically destroy all black wealth in the townships. So all the possibilities, the townships, the families that were growing and doing things, apartheid crushed that. So that structural damage that was done by colonialism and apartheid was very real. What we've underestimated is that just by managing to stabilize the economy, you don't impact on that. So I agree with you. The mind shift we must change now is we must see developing those areas as the greatest and most important form of growth. That's the mindset we must fight for now. Investment coming in, Comrade Cyril's target, is just a support. It's not going to be the key. The key is our own leadership we give to investing in our communities, because it's an industrial strategy too. When you're putting roads and pipes and water and electricity and broadband fiber in there, we can make all those things and supply our people so that their lives change. And I would say one of our biggest mistakes, most of us even forgotten it, was called the Integrated Development Planning Structure. There was an act, it's an act in law. It's probably the least implemented act from that time. So we made a mistake. As Essop said, there's some things we just got wrong. One of them was not implementing that integrated development planning framework properly. We've got to go back and look at it again. On the policy changes, I would say they're not that massive, but they're not implemented for long enough. So the RDP, the gear, there are those who argue gear was a massive retreat. I think you know our position. Gear was a stabilizing measure dealing with the macroeconomic. Those who argue that it overrode the RDP and that, really, we could debate it for hours, but I think it's a very hard case to make. It's more an ideological proposition that the Communist Party chose to put to the forefront at that time. The Asgisa, if you look closely at the NDP, it builds quite a bit on Asgisa. The problem is that NDP was a build on to Asgisa, but then the NDP just didn't get implemented. So although I've got some criticisms of the NDP, I think it's not comprehensive enough. I don't think it gives enough attention to these poor areas. I think we should do it. But it's a relatively coherent program. The issue is to start implementing it properly. But as we've stressed time and again, our biggest challenge is to strengthen the institutions at a local level. Best cadres, best people back into the community areas, and we have to place massive emphasis on the former homeland areas and the townships. I think that offers a considerable growth. You said the process looks like learning by doing. I fear it was a bit, but that's history. We had a lot of ideas, but implementing them in the South African context, bloody difficult. This is a difficult society. It's tough, and I think that's a fair criticism in my view also. I think that we gave such priority to the economy in the early stages that it was a strong cluster and it had the full backing of Mandela and Mbeki. They were very powerful backers of the economic policy. But we should have possibly put a lot more attention into the institutional fabric of our education system, healthcare system, and social welfare. One shouldn't underestimate the advances we made in welfare payments. I don't know of any country outside of, more recently, Brazil, that have put in, or Mexico possibly too, that have put in such considerable welfare systems without causing macroeconomic instability. So we've had some successes, but I would share your view that our institutional attention to key institutions, local government, health, education and welfare has not been strong enough. And I think I've made a comment on Tommy's comment that we don't expect the private sector to come to parties. They only come to parties if it looks attractive. They don't make parties, I can tell you that. That's my experience. Private sector doesn't make a party. But a government that's clear, that can engage properly with the private sector, we don't have to be hostile to them, we shouldn't be hostile to them, and that has got its own state structures that can lead the growth process. That is the solution. That's where we were going in 2007-8, to build powerful state companies. On SMME with the state companies, we had two very, very big programs, and I'm going to express a note of anger here. We developed very sophisticated supplier development programs for Transnet in the purchase of railway equipment and for Eskom in the purchase of Kusile and Medupi. Those started to develop a long-term supply line for small and medium enterprises. So unfortunately, what your principle, I absolutely agree with. State enterprises can play a massively important role in developing effective small and medium enterprises. But you've got to implement that policy there. And we learned the policy. We went and studied Temasek. We went and studied the Finns. We studied big auto companies in Detroit who did it. And we put in a whole policy. We followed best practice around the world. And it was abandoned. We have to reinstate it. Thank you.
Let me just respond to what was said about the apartheid legacy. Of course, we should not be terrified by legacies. Of course, we should not be petrified. But if you don't understand the legacy you've inherited, I'm afraid you're not going to find the correct policies. So, if you don't understand your own history, I'm afraid you're not going to make any good history. If after more than 30, 40, 50 years, even after 100 years, we can still talk about the negative impact of colonization on our societies, that's a legacy. But we shouldn't be tied to it. That's what I agree with you, is that we shouldn't be tied to it. We shouldn't be so petrified by it. What we need to do is to think out of the box and think, how then do we deal with this legacy, which has had such a profound detrimental impact upon the lives of millions of our people. We can't escape from that. You can't escape from the Bantustan policies. You can't escape from spatial apartheid. Even if we do, and we must, it's part of our policy. We took that policy that we were going to build more RDP homes, we're going to build other homes nearer to places of work where our people work. Of course, it still remains disgraceful that so many of our workers have to spend nearly a third or a half of their meager wages on transport costs. Of course, it's not acceptable, it's not defensible. But we're faced with the reality that Soweto exists. You can't take 2 million people out of Soweto and bring them here in Johannesburg. Then you'll have to take this one from Johannesburg and send them to Soweto. Goodness knows how many policy discussion documents we generated from the policy unit in the presidency, just about spatial apartheid and how to deal with it. So I just want to say thank you to everybody that participated. I think the interventions, Wally, were really good. The questions were good. And I think there's something else for us and David and them to think about, which is perhaps now we've dealt with a bit of the history, and I'm glad Alec ended off by talking about the importance of the state sector. So that means no neoliberalism, because neoliberalism means no involvement of the state. It's as simple as that. That we need to look at the present day policies, not only of ourselves, but what's happening in the continent, in the world. What is it that we can do to deal with the rural economy? What is it that we need to do? By the way, if you don't learn by doing, my brother, you're not going to learn anything. But if your policies are determined by just learning from doing, then you're going to do the wrong things. But Chief, if you don't do anything, you won't learn anything. Okay, thanks.
Well, Excellencies, thank you very much for having come. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm sure we will again convene here, but I'd like to leave you with the words that I think we have absolute reason to be very optimistic given the discussion that went on today. The world has changed. Potential on the African continent, potential in terms of BRICS, and so forth. But I think there are two things that I would like to put on your agenda so that we don't forget. The first thing is that there are 3 scourges in our country. We have to find a manner to focus on, as it has been said here, on what is it that we should do to transform this unemployment, poverty, and discrimination. But if I also take from what Comrade Essop was saying at one point related to the white reactionary forces that existed, some of the changes that happened after 2006 and 7, which almost curtailed potential for complete transformation. We must wonder and say, how do we name this thing that happened? And my view is that we should contemplate and say, are we seeing something like counter-revolution here? So that as we plan, we must have named this thing and understood what kind of animal is this. David, shall I hand over to you? Thank you very much for having come. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our session. This has been indeed an interesting session. One thing that we would say, it's intergenerational, as you can see. We would like to encourage more of intergenerational conversation. These are some of our senior comrades who have been in the struggle, been in government, and we're also encouraging here right at University of Johannesburg for senior comrades such as Comrade Eric Owen and Comrade Essop Pahad. I know there are great writers, but to constantly write and open this kind of discussions where a clear understanding of the past and the present, and we try to have a conversation in a non-confrontational, as the case these days.